Hey, I'm Andrew with 10-Minute Therapy, and in our last couple of videos, we've begun a series examining depression. Now, in our first video on depression, we looked at what is depression, followed by our last video on how we combat depression. But the truth is, we're just scratching the surface on this topic, and so in today's video, we're going to look at what might arguably be one of the most important pieces in understanding depression, and that is a sense of hopelessness. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and start the clock. We'll dive right in. So in our first video on depression, we sort of defined what depression is, and we actually left with a lot of questions trying to better understand where life and grief end and depression clinically begins. And in our last video, we looked at some ways we might combat depression, things we have control of, things that we can do every day in order to better help ourselves avoid bouts of depression, things like exercise, socialization, and even volunteer work. And we noted that when we combine these things with, say, counseling or even medication from a psychiatrist or a PCP, we get a really holistic treatment plan that is better designed to treat depression as a whole. But as we examine all those things, we have to step back and say, look, if treating depression was as easy as exercising, volunteering once a week, connecting with people and friends around us, and maybe going to counseling or even considering medication, then surely we would have cured depression by now. In other words, if doing those things was that easy and everyone could do it and it would lead to a positive outcome, we would have surely by now been able to avoid depression being on such a large scale. And so there has to be this question of what exactly is happening in our country, in our society, in people who experience depression, that we're seeing rates of depression continually rise from, say, the mid-90s to now, with a stark rise in the early 2000s into the 2010s. And I believe part of the reason for this is what we're going to look at today, and that's the topic of hopelessness. You see, when you look at depression as a whole, though we've discussed some of the symptoms and criteria being things like a loss of motivation, lack of self-care, self-isolating behaviors, etc., the reality is that the most, forgive this word, important criteria that we identify, the most driving force in the individual experiencing depression, is a sense of hopelessness. And so we have to examine that and understand, what does that mean? Why is that there? Where does that come from? And why is it so important that we have hope as individuals? And I think part of the answer to this, as we start to dive in, is that hope gives us something to look forward to. Hope inspires joy, excitement, passion, desire, all these things within us. When we step back, let's look at this, for example. As human beings, we are, to our knowledge, the only creatures on Earth that have the ability to imagine something in the front of our minds and experience in the back of our minds emotion. The front and back part, I'm simply referring to parts of the brain, but think of it this way. We're the only creatures that can think about something and experience real emotion in response to that thing. If you recall one of the videos that we made on anxiety, we examined how our very thinking can cause anxiety. I think about something and I experience anxiety in response to my thinking, even though that thing may not be real. But in the same way, when we experience hope, when we imagine something in our minds that we're looking forward to, we experience joy, satisfaction, excitement, energy. We feel better simply by imagining the things that we enjoy. That gives us a sense of hope. And so hope becomes this very important piece of how we function as human beings. It's interesting to note that Dr. van der Kolk, the psychiatrist who wrote the book The Body Keeps the Score, his incredible insight and intake on what we call PTSD, noted that when he was working with veterans from the Vietnam War, he noticed across the board, an observation he made is that they lacked hope. And as he dug into this more through sessions and treatments and things that he was doing with these veterans, he noticed they didn't just lack hope. It was as if It was as if their brain had lost the ability to envision life in a positive manner. And so, because they could not envision their life in a positive manner, they therefore then could not experience hope. And without hope, they sunk farther into depression. Without hope, we sort of reach this point that says, why does it matter? What's the point? What's the point in exercising? What's the point in going for a walk or showing up at that family event and connecting with people? What's the point of volunteering? None of it matters. What's the point? That sense of hopelessness that takes over is actually sort of the pinnacle answer in depression that we can answer with and say, why is it that people in depression, though exercise would help, they don't want to exercise? It's like pulling teeth to try to get that loved one with depression to get out and go for a walk. Why is it with depression that even though we know socialization helps enormously, that somebody with depression has a really hard time committing to showing up to anything socially? Why is it in depression, even though we know volunteering would help heal the soul, getting them to motivate themselves to do that might feel almost impossible? And the answer is because they feel hopeless. When we take away hope, we start to lose something that is so important to us as human beings, something that we rely on every day. When we can't envision our lives with hope, with meaning, with value, with purpose, looking forward to things, we just sink farther and farther back. Now, clinically, one of the answers here, and we addressed this in one of our previous videos, is that for a long time, the theory behind depression is that there's a chemical imbalance going on in the brain, that the brain is either not producing enough serotonin, or it just needs more serotonin, or there's some kind of reaction going on. But here more recently, as we shared in a previous video, there's research that says we don't actually have any evidence of that. Now, maybe there's another chemical reaction going on in the brain we just haven't identified yet. But it's not just as simple as a chemical reaction. There's something in us that's causing us to feel a lack of motivation. People with depression aren't just lazy. They feel hopeless. They feel stuck. They feel like it doesn't matter what they do. So what's the point? Why do the things that might help them actually feel better? And so as a therapist, or maybe for you, if you have a loved one that suffers from depression, it can feel very difficult. It can feel like you're stuck. Like you can see all the things that might help this person, but you just can't get them to do those things. And I think one of the best studies that helps us understand this was a study conducted many years ago in the 1960s by two psychiatrists, I believe. A guy by the name of Martin Seligman and another one by the name of Meyer. And they did a study into what we now call learned helplessness. And so you might notice I'm jumping from hope or hopelessness to helplessness, but I believe there's a big connection here in depression. And so in this learned helplessness study in the 1960s, I believe it was published in 1967, what they did was this: they took dogs and they put them in cages. And at first, they would electrify, not enough to significantly harm the animal, but certainly enough to scare them and maybe cause a little bit of pain. They would electrify part of the cage, but the dog could hop to the other part of the cage that wasn't electrified and be safe. And so the dogs learned, okay, when I hear this buzzer and the electricity starts, I know that hurts, but I can jump to this place where I'm safe. But then in the second phase of the experiment, they started to do something different. They started to electrify the whole cage. The door's locked, the dog can't escape, and now they're in pain. And so at first, when they would experience this, the dogs would fight, they would growl, they would bite at the cage, they'd jump back and forth. They were fighting desperately, trying to find a way out of this pain that they were in. What they found is as they conducted this experiment, over and over again, eventually the animals, the dogs in this case, submitted to the pain. They learned from their experience, when I experience this pain, I'm stuck and there's nothing I can do. And so it reached a point where when they would electrify the cages, the dogs would lay down, wet themselves, whimper, cry. They just gave up. They developed what we now call learned helplessness. They learned that they were helpless to fight against this thing. So much so that in the third phase of the experiment, once the dogs reached that point of learned helplessness, they could open the doors to the kennels and the dogs wouldn't leave. And with the door open, they could even electrify the kennels and the dogs would just lay there because their experience had taught them, what's the point? There's no hope. I can't fight this. I can't get out of it. Now, an important phase 4 part of the experiment was they found that when they started to physically lead the dogs out through the open door, and they repeated that over and over, eventually the dogs could relearn, no, I'm not helpless. I'm not hopeless. I can fight this, and there is a way out. But it took someone coming alongside them and physically guiding them out of these kennels. And I think this experiment helps us to better understand what happens in someone who is experiencing depression, whether it's you or someone you know. That though a sense of hopelessness keeps us feeling stuck, so you might say, hey, honey, I know that you're not feeling well. Let's go for a walk. Let's go have that family dinner. Let's go have a friend over. Let's go work at the soup kitchen this weekend. And the person says, no, I'm good. What's the point? I don't want to do any of that. As people sink into depression and they feel the sense of hopelessness, one of the things we need to know is that maybe they're also experiencing what we call a learned helplessness. Maybe somewhere along the way, wires got crossed and life experience taught this person, what's the point? Nothing. I can't control or stop the negative events of my life. They just happen, and I'm hopeless and helpless to stop them. And so they fall into this pattern of learned helplessness. But what we can take from the experiment is there's a way out. There's a way to break hopelessness and learned helplessness. It requires that someone comes alongside and walks with them and guides them out of that dark place. Dr. Ed Welch refers to depression as a stubborn darkness. And it is just that, a stubborn darkness that clings on and holds on. But hear me, whether you're a counselor, whether you're the one that experiences depression, or maybe it's a loved one, someone you know and care about, depression is not hopeless and it is not helpless. There is a way out. But what we can do for those that we love and care about is lead them. We can show them. We can walk with them. We give them our energy, our attention, our connection, and we have an opportunity to help lead them out and break that cycle of learned helplessness. We have an opportunity to break that sense of hopelessness that their brain can't envision life being better, that it only sees this stuck loop. We have an opportunity to help folks break that. It requires nothing of you financially. It requires of your time, your attention, your eye contact, your love and compassion. I hope this is helpful as we look at hopelessness and helplessness. We'll continue next week with another video on depression as we look at what we can do to help ourselves and help others walk out of the stubborn darkness. But in the meantime, I'm Andrew with 10 Minute Therapy. God bless.